welcome back from 1 week in the future, right? Yeah, Wednesday. So today we are talking vascular plants. On Monday we talked about non-vascular plants, which are our mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, otherwise known as our bryophytes. But today we are talking ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. So our pteridophytes are conifers and their relatives, and our fruiting and flowering plants. So vascular plants are much more complicated than their non-vascular counterparts, mainly because they have a vascular system. So on Monday, we talked about what a plant's vascular system is. It's like their circulatory system that they use to move water from their roots up to their leaves, and they also use it to move nutrients and sugar around their body. So it's kind of like plant veins. So this was a huge evolutionary breakthrough when this happened. When plants evolved a vascular system, it was like sliced bread. Like, now they can grow really big because they can get water to the top of their body. So now we've got grasses, and now we've got shrubs, and now we've got vines, and now we've got trees. So we've got trees that can grow hundreds of feet tall because they're able to move water up into their leaves from their roots. They can also store food now because they can move it around their body. So if they've got a whole bunch of sugar in one place, send it somewhere else into your roots or into your ground tissue and hold it there until you really need it. So now plants are hardier, they're bigger, they're stronger, they can grow in different environments now, and they don't need water to survive. Well, they need water to survive, but they don't have to live in an aquatic environment. So now we've got like cacti and things that can survive in super arid, dry climates. So this was a huge breakthrough for plants, and they now arguably dominate the planet because of that evolutionary breakthrough. So we have ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms that fit into this group. We're going to be talking about all three of them kind of as one group today, and then on Friday I'm going to break them down into their three separate groups and talk about their reproductive cycles. But for now, just they're all the same. They're plants, vascular plants. So our vascular plants have three different types of tissue. So they're tissue types. They have dermal tissue, they have vascular tissue, and they have ground tissue. So their dermal tissue is like our epidermis, like skin. So that is the outermost layer of a plant's body. And it prevents damage to the plant, and it also prevents water loss. So if you've ever touch the surface of a leaf and it feels like waxy or something like that, that's like their cuticle. That's a part of their epidermis, their dermal layer. Or like bark on a tree, that's a part of their dermal tissues, but it's like dead. But we'll talk about that. And then, so that prevents damage and water loss. Then they've got their vascular tissue, which makes them vascular plants. So vascular plants, as we talked about, can move water and nutrients around their body, and the way they do that is using their vascular tissue. So vascular tissue is a conductive, they're like conductive cells that are shaped like long tubes, and they can suck the water up and shoot it up into the next cell, and then it moves up the plant's body. How do they do this, you may ask? How do they defy gravity with water? Great question. If you recall when we talked about the water cycle, which was forever ago, like November? Yeah. So when we talked about the water cycle, we talked about water moving from plants to the atmosphere. And do you remember what that's called? Exactly, evapotranspiration. Amazing. Your recall is really good on you. So evapotranspiration is when the water leaves a plant through its leaves, and that creates a negative pressure. So like when like a siphon or something like that. Like it creates like a vacuum basically. So it's like there's negative space in the top of the leaf where the water used to be, so that wants to be filled up by something. So water moves up the stem to fill that up, and from the roots it moves up into the stem, and then from the ground it moves into the roots. So plants basically create a vacuum by releasing water out of their leaves so that they continuously can take up water from the soil. Fascinating. So plants have two different types of vascular tissue. They have the xylem and they have the phloem. So the xylem, which is spelled like this, and then the phloem, these are our two types of vascular tissue. So the xylem are long tubule-like cells that conduct water up the stem. So they go from the roots to the leaves and they just move water. So the xylem is conducting water all day long from the roots to the leaves. And then once it's released out of the leaves, it creates the negative pressure, which continues the vacuum. Then the phloem is what moves around sugar and nutrients and stuff like that. So the way plants move around sugar is they mix it with water and create sap. And then they can move that up and down their phloem cells, which are also like cylindrical tubule cells like this that can carry around the sap. So if they've got a lot of it in one place, and then they take it to the roots to store it, and then once they need it again, they take it back out and take it to a leaf and use it for energy. So that's the xylem and the phloem. The third type of tissue that plants have is ground tissue, which is basically like everything else, like the other stuff that's not used for moving things and isn't the epidermis. So this is like where photosynthesis happens, this is where food storage happens, like everything that isn't moving things or plant skin is the ground tissue. So it sounds boring, but it is really important. So this is where we kind of break off into two types of plants. We've got herbaceous plants and woody plants. We've talked about this difference before, that woody plants are woody, they've got wood like trees and shrubs and some vines, and herbaceous plants don't, like wildflowers and grass and ferns and stuff like that. But the real difference is that our herbaceous plants, they grow their vascular tissue, their dermal tissue, and their ground tissue, and then they are done. Those are their only three tissue types. This is called primary growth. So all plants have these tissues. All vascular plants have these three tissue types. So some of them grow those three, that primary growth of the dermal tissue, vascular tissue, and ground tissue, and then they're done. Those are herbaceous plants. So those are ferns, flowers, herbs. They're small typically, and they're soft. They don't have like the hard woodiness, and they die after 1 year. So like trees will survive through a year, herbaceous plants will not. Like your grass in your yard dies at some point. Your wildflowers in the forest are gonna die during the winter, but trees don't do that. So those are our herbaceous plants. They go through primary growth, then they're done. Our woody plants go through that primary growth just like herbaceous plants do. So they grow their dermal tissue, their vascular tissue, and their ground tissue. But then they get another tissue that is basically woody tissue. So this is made of lignin, which we talked about when we talked about fungi, who are the only ones that can break this stuff down. So this is a really strong material that makes up like the bark on a tree. So this woody material is really strong, and it can hold up the super tall tree, and it can keep water from being lost out of the trunk, and it allows them to survive longer than just one growing season. So our woody plants go through this growth, which we call secondary growth. So they go through their primary growth, but then they keep growing these woody tissues, and that's called secondary growth. So our trees, our shrubs, and our woody vines go through secondary growth to get that hard woody material. So those are our two types of plants and why they are different, herbaceous and woody. But they all have the three basic parts of the plant, which is shown down here in this beautiful diagram that I drew myself, yes. So we've got the three basic parts of a plant. You've got the roots, you've got the stem, and you've got the leaf. makes sense. You probably learned this in like 2nd grade, but we are going to go a little bit deeper than this. So let's start up here with the leaf. The leaf is where your photosynthesizing tissue is. So this is in your ground tissue. You've got the cells with chloroplasts, with plastids inside of them, with the chlorophyll pigment inside of them that can photosynthesize. So it gets that energy from the sun and they perform photosynthesis. So that all of that is happening in the leaf. They also exchange gases in the leaf. So gas exchange is when they are taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. This gas exchange happens in the stomata. So stomata are on the underside of leaves, and they look, we talked about them when we talked about evapotranspiration before. They look like 2 lima beans hugging. They look like this. So these are called the guard cells, and then this opening here is called the stoma. Together they make up the stomata. So these are tiny openings that are all over the bottom of a leaf, the underside of a leaf, and they open up and they release oxygen and they take in carbon dioxide. So that is the gas exchange that's happening on the underside of the leaf. That happens in the stomata. So they've got the stomata, they've got their chloroplasts, which are the specialized organelles with chlorophyll that do photosynthesis, blah, blah, blah. You already know this. And then we've got the mesophyll, which is the middle part of the leaf. It's kind of like everything else. So this is where the xylem and phloem, it's kind of like their train station where they drop off their water, take in their sugar or whatever, is happening in the mesophyll. So in the leaf, you've got gas exchange, you've got photosynthesis going on, you've also got that evapotranspiration, so the water is leaving the leaf through the stoma as well, through the stomata. So moving down, we then have the stem. The stem also has a couple of specialized cell types, depending on what type of plant it is. So all vascular plants have collenchyma cells. Collenchyma cells are elongated cells with thick cell walls that hold up the plant body. So this is like the stem of a fern or the stem of a flower has those collenchyma cells. That's why it's kind of thicker and harder than other parts of the cell, the other parts of the plant, because it's got those collenchyma cells. So all plants have these, but especially herbaceous plants like ferns and wildflowers and grasses and herbs, because they don't have the other type of cell, which is what makes up woody tissue, and those are called sclerenchyma cells. So you've got collenchyma and sclerenchyma. Sclerenchyma cells are in the xylem, and they kind of surround the xylem in the middle of the stem, and they have really thick cell walls made of lignin, which again is that super strong polymer that we've been talking about that only fungi, certain types of fungi, can break down. So that lignin makes the cell wall really, really strong. And so the cell grows and it's got this super strong cell wall, and then the cell just dies. But the cell wall doesn't go away. It stays there. It stays, really hard and strong, and the cell just leaves it behind and dies and gets smushed. But you still have that cell wall. So the cells keep doing this. They keep growing and growing that strong cell wall and then dying. And what happens is you just have all of these really strong layers of lignin that pack up against each other, and it's all dead, but it's still that lignin, that strong polymer material. And this is what makes up bark on a tree. So the outer layer of trees are dead, the bark is, but you still shouldn't peel it off because it's still mean to do. It still hurts the tree. Don't do that. But that is what makes up a tree's bark, is its sclerenchyma cells that have long died. So every season or every year, a tree experiences some amount of growth of the sclerenchyma cells, and then they all die off. Then the next year, it'll experience growth of the sclerenchyma cells, and then they'll all die. It happens again and again and again, and this is what makes tree rings, which is why we can date trees and kind of find out what the climate was like when that tree was alive at different periods using tree rings, which is pretty cool. And then we make our way down to the bottom of the plant in the roots. So the roots are what take in the, you guys are blowing up my messages. Anyways, so the root is what absorbs water and nutrients out of the soil. This is also where that mycorrhizal mutualistic relationship happens with fungi. And this is where they store food, and the roots also keep a plant anchored in place. So plant roots actually have a lot of functions. They don't just take in water, so they keep the plant steady, keep it stable in place. They take in nutrients, they have mutualistic relationships with fungi, and they store food. Who knew? Another great thing about roots is that they hold the soil in place. So we've talked about erosion and different environmental impacts of that before. So plant roots will hold soil in place, which is why they're super, super important. So that just about wraps up our vascular plant lesson. So I will see you on Friday for our vascular plant reproduction lesson in 2 days, or for me, in about 30 seconds.